بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباد الله الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه إلى يوم الدين وبعد. So my name is Hamzah. I am your guest through the magnanimity of certain individuals, most of whom I don't know. I have this small presentation that I've been working on, and I'm still working on, it's a work in progress, that I have put together regarding modernity, modernism, not in the sense of being alive in 2017, because even if you live in a cave and you boycott electronics and technology and eat raw meat or whatever, wear fur skins, you're still going to be in the same time. I mean, you don't live in a different time, right? You're going to be in the same time that we're in right now. But modernity with regards to a set of philosophies that were in vogue in Europe in the 1800s, that are a natural development and progression of ideas that had been cooking in Europe for some centuries from before that, as a result of a number of cultural and historical and political phenomena, and that have basically gained currency in circles of academic learning and political power and business, essentially around the world, Turkey being no exception to that trend. Is there anyone here who is a student of philosophy, whether as an undergrad or as a graduate? You guys are going to have fun. If you guys were students of philosophy, you would have had even more fun. One of the unfortunate things, as kind of a side tangent, is that philosophy is no longer a cool thing to study. Parents tell children things like, how are you going to pay rent and no one's going to marry you? Therefore everyone becomes a doctor and an engineer, which is wonderful for when you need to build bridges and when you need to give someone antibiotics for a sore throat. But if you actually want to be able to think clearly, like every other skill, some practice is required. And one of the reasons that I put this presentation together for the benefit of for people like myself who are simple-minded people and not people who are trained in sophisticated forms of thought, it allows us to examine certain assumptions that we have with regards to the world around us that may or may not be correct. So one small and simple request that I have from everybody, I realize, mashallah, this is like crazy looking guy, beard and all of these things coming up in front of you. You're probably, some of you are surprised he even knows English and whatnot. For now, for this small amount of time, all of us are students of philosophy. Meaning what? I want you to think about everything that's said purely in the realm of ideas. Don't pay attention to who's saying it. Don't pay attention to what people will think about it. Don't pay attention to whether it's fashionable or not fashionable. Evaluate the ideas based on their own merit and feel free to disagree, inshallah. I like talking to people who agree with me, but the only people who I like talking to more than that is people who disagree, because in disagreement that's rooted in etiquette and rooted in an intention to learn and to benefit, in the intention of the love of knowledge from both sides, that disagreement, good comes from it. There's a lot of good that comes from it. So this is essentially a 6-hour presentation. I will condense certain highlights into what? How much? Where's the organizers? When does this thing need to be done by? 2 hours. Okay. So what I'll try to do is since we're a little bit late and I want to have question and answers, I'll try to make it maybe an hour, 15 minutes at max. And since I lost my watch, I'm going to have to use my phone, so I'm not trying to be antisocial. Okay, so this is the presentation, the modules of it. Obviously, I'm not a person who's employed at an academic institution. I'm by profession, I'm a student of Islamic knowledge, not from the side of academia, but from the traditional, the path of traditional study of Islam. The two of them are similar. Obviously, people in academia have great knowledge of Islam as well, but perhaps the difference between a traditional scholar and between an academic studying Islam is like the difference between somebody who plays basketball and somebody who commentates about it. A commentator may have very wonderful insights with regards to the game, who scores a lot of points, what some strengths and some weaknesses are, how things can be changed. but there's an intuitively different quality of experience when you're actually in the game playing itself. And sometimes you have certain people who are players and they become commentators as well. But so if you're not a Muslim, or if you don't agree with everything I say, that's okay. We don't all have to agree. This is not like a Big Brother 1981 attempt to impose my ideas on you. Just I wanted to give that preface. So there's 5 modules, the summary of which is what? The first module has to do with what, because this is generally given to Muslim audiences. One of the problems with everybody becoming a doctor and engineer is that people no longer know what Islam is anymore. People say, well, what do you mean you don't know Islam? I know I'm not supposed to eat pork, I don't drink alcohol, I pray 5 times a day, and someday when I become light-haired, gray-haired, I'll go do Hajj maybe. Those are particular parts of Islam. They're not part of its universal understanding. There's a difference between particulars and between universals. Particularity is good in one time, one place. Universals are those things that are valid in all times, all places. Now, philosophically speaking, we're in a time where the idea of some sort of universal principle even existing is debated or not. But the intellectual legacy of Muslim thought does accept and maintain that there are certain things that are universally true in all different times and all different places. And those universal ideas are not found in our sacred law. They're found in what? They're found in the study of usul and the studies of principles, the highest of which is creed. And those matters are very few. Now, the problem is if you don't study creed, what happens? You have people who don't understand what the universal principles of Islam are. And so Islam means something different to every single different person, which is wonderful. If you have your favorite soccer team, and I have my own favorite soccer team, sometimes it does end in violence, but generally speaking, most people have it's not funny. People die in riots and things like that, get drunk and get into fights and whatnot. But generally speaking, most people are able to behave themselves. The problem with a powerful set of ideas, like Islam, like Christianity, like Buddhism, right? And it's not just in some people are like, oh look, religion is the cause of all of this bloodshed. Last time I checked, Stalin wasn't praying 5 times a day, Hitler wasn't praying 5 times a day, neither were particularly religious people, and if it was like a soccer match, they're definitely the lead scorers when it comes to murder. And both of them were essentially secular. One was actually militantly secular. The problem is that certain ideas are so powerful, if a person doesn't understand them properly, they will become like giving a loaded weapon to a small child. This is why the idea of having scholarly authority is not only a ploy for the state to enslave people, the minds of people, and religion is the opiate of the masses and we need to wake up from all this. The problem is certain ideas are so powerful, people who understand things better should be given a place to speak and an authority to teach for the benefit of everybody, because certain loaded weapons, if you give them to a child, someone's going to get shot, and then afterward people have no one to blame but themselves. So the idea, and we're going to essentially skip this, this module for lack of time, but the synopsis of it is what? Is that Islam is primarily a message meant for what? The prime objective, salvation in the hereafter. Islam is not primarily a political theology. Islam is not primarily a vehicle in order to erect a certain state or a type of government. Islam is not primarily a vehicle that, for the amputation of the limbs of thieves and the stoning and lashing of adulterers and all of these other things. Some of these things might be a part of Islam in a certain way or another, some of them might not. But the primary objective is what? Is salvation in the hereafter. It's not a worldly objective. And the reason this is something that requires mention is that a great amount of violence that happens in the Muslim world and in the interaction between people who have great enthusiasm for Islam but not great understanding, and other Muslims or people of other faiths and other traditions, is based on this misunderstanding. Okay, fine, you like the Ottoman Empire and you have nostalgia for it. It's not a reason to go and kill other people. If a person, for example, gains their salvation and they're not able to erect a state, and one person erects a state but they're not able to gain their salvation in the hereafter. It's like the difference between a person is looking for a car. So there's two cars. One car, it drives but the AC doesn't work. The other car has a wonderful AC but it doesn't go anywhere. Do you understand what I'm saying? The AC is not, you cannot say the AC is not part of the car, it's part of the car. Anyone who denies that Islam has nothing to do with politics and we should divorce Islam and politics, obviously hasn't read history or understand Islam or really understand politics for that matter. All of these things are definitely intertwined. But there's a hierarchy of priorities, and the primary priority, if a person understands the salvific message of Islam, that person has understood the greater part of Islam, and the rest of the things may be a part of Islam, they may not be a part of Islam, but they are details. They are details, they're not principles. And so I bring a number of different texts, both from the Quran and from the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, basically in order to push that point forward, that are categorical. They're categorical. Certain pronouncements are specific and certain pronouncements are general and certain pronouncements are categorical, mutlaq. They have no exception whatsoever. And that's from those pronouncements. So Islam is not there for people's material benefit. Anyone who preaches to you in Islam that if you join my cult or my version of Islam, you'll become rich. You say this dua, you'll become rich. You say this prayer like this, you'll become rich. Obviously, they haven't studied the history of Islam. The people that Islam holds in the highest of esteem, most of them, Islam was not really there for their economical benefit. And if it was, it's an exception, not the rule. It's not there for people to love you. Because speaking the truth, this is a universal condition. This is not something specific to Muslims. Speaking the truth doesn't make friends for you, but it's the right thing to do. This is a theological issue in Islam as well. Al-haq, the truth. This is one of the divine names of God in our tradition, and this is one of the sifat, one of the divine attributes as well. And it may be bitter. It may be difficult to swallow, but it has an attraction of its own. That the person who has some connection with it, that person will be able to survive and be patient on meager means and on difficult trials and tribulations. And the person who doesn't have it, that person, despite all types of wealth and comfort, will not be able to sleep at night. Have you not looked at the history of America itself? The slaves that were freed in America, were they freed because the slaves at some point had enough power and built enough army that they were able to gain their freedom by force? No. It's because what? Because falsehood is something that cannot abide. It cannot abide for forever. It cannot abide for a long time. It causes people to lose sleep at night. It will literally, if people don't submit to the truth, falsehood will literally turn brother against brother and rip houses apart. What do you think it's going to do for a society? And the same thing plays out again afterward in America. We used to have a set of laws called the Jim Crow laws. Black people cannot drink from the same water fountain as white people. Myself, my parents immigrated to America from Pakistan. Punjab is basically the breadbasket of North India. It's the area between the city of Delhi and Peshawar. And it was the most productive land in India. And its land was very similar to the land in the Central Valley of California. So it's little known that they actually brought farmers from Punjab to the Central Valley. Some of them were so skilled that they could taste the soil and they would know which crops will grow in which place. And they came and they literally erected the agricultural industry in the state of California, which is, to this day, California produce goes to every state of the United States. Some of its produce goes to China and other parts of the world as well. You can maybe even find certain produce from the West Coast in supermarkets in Turkey as well. Those people were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to own land, so some of them, what did they do? They would go to a white person and say, hey, can you sign the deed in my name and hold this land for me? And some of the people, they said yes, and afterward they turned around and took the deed and left, and some of them were actually honored their word, and they submitted the deeds to these people afterward when the laws changed and they could legally hold the land themselves. The idea is all of this falsehood, it abides for a small amount of time. Justice and truth always prevails. This is a matter of what? This is a matter of aqidah, it's a matter of creed for a Muslim. But the idea that Islam will make people love you, even if you're not a Muslim, the idea that speaking the truth is going to make you like popular and people will love you and this and that, maybe like 300 years after you're dead, someone will write something nice about you in a history book. Maybe. Not even that all the time. But it has its own attraction, it has its own life, it has its own enjoyment, it has its own honor. That's something that people should look forward to, regardless of whether it makes you popular or not. It's meant to make your life in this world easy. You know, waking up for Fajr, you know, kind of quashes that one. It's equally political, social, economic system, as well as a spiritual system. Well, look at those people who are trying to implement its political system by force, how far they're going, and how much benefit they're causing Islam, much less anybody else. So that's a quick synopsis of that module that we don't have time to go through. Now this brings us to a couple of concepts in philosophy. Philosophy, a prerequisite in order to understand philosophy is understanding logic. Now, logic, the word logic has a kind of a colloquial meaning amongst people who are untrained in philosophy. And logic means, it's like synonymous with something that makes sense. But there's like a formal study of logic, which is a prerequisite in order to understand philosophy. The idea is that ancient peoples, they understood that different groups and different individuals, they don't always agree with one another about ideas. And instead of fighting every time you have a different disagreement and a difference of opinion with one another, there needs to be a way that you can speak to one another and present your ideas to them and have them present their ideas to you so that people can mutually benefit from knowledge. And that involves what? That involves agreeing on certain principles, or at least delineating what you agree upon. And that's what logic is. Those are those principles that everybody who is deemed of sound mind would agree upon. Simple principles like what? Like the idea that a part of something cannot be greater than the whole thing. The idea that if A equals B and B equals C, then what should the relationship be between A and C? What should it be? It should be equal, right? Now, from the definitions of the ancient philosophers, this logic that I'm talking about is generally attributed to Aristotle. They call it Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle is far from being the one who discovered it. He is credited with the founding of this discipline because he committed it to writing in a good way that was presentable and replicable. Otherwise, he's far from the first person who came up with this. This is an issue that Western European historians have. They have difficulty accepting that anyone else other than themselves exists. And it becomes comical at times. I live in America. I don't have a bias against Europeans or against other people or a chip on the shoulder, but this is an issue. So for example, Columbus discovered America in 1492. Well, Leif Erikson discovered it 400 years before. Now, the idea is just the fact that two people can have this exchange with one another. And there's like millions of people who live in America at the time. And that doesn't strike a person as odd. Okay, there's a little bit of an issue. The good thing is once you admit there's a problem, you can get help. But this is one of the reasons that they attribute this, the Aristotelian logic to Aristotle, or they assume that it starts from him, even though this is wisdom of the ancients. These are things that are passed to oral tradition from ancient times. And so this kind of Aristotelian philosophy, it divides knowledge into different types. The first type of knowledge is what? It's called empirical knowledge. Right? Everybody knows what empirical means because you guys are all probably becoming engineers and doctors, right? Right? What does it mean? It means some things you can see, taste, smell, touch. Right? It's empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge is something shared by humans and animals. If you take a dog and you stick its paw in the fire, first of all, you're a sick person. Second of all, the dog will also understand fire hot, that's bad, let's not do this again. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not something that requires, it doesn't require like a whole lot of understanding. If you see snow, you touch it, you know it's cold. It's something that even animals can understand. Many animals, not all animals, I guess. But it's something that's experiential. Now, the good thing about empirical knowledge is it's like a no-brainer. It's like a slam dunk. You understand something in a very direct and intuitive way that doesn't require any, much higher brain function. But the problem with it is what? Is that if you have to experience everything over and over again, then you are going to have a very difficult life. If every time you see a fire and you wonder, is this one hot too? It's a problem, right? So the second type of knowledge is this rational knowledge that we talked about, this Aristotelian rational knowledge, which A equals B. Like, for example, we have something called A, you stick it in the scale pan, and then you stick in the other scale pan B. If they both weigh the same, and then B equals C, then the relationship of A and C, do you have to empirically verify it? You don't have to. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. You know that A will equal C. Unless there's some sort of mistake in your process, A must equal C in weight. You don't have to verify it again and again. So the benefit of rational thought is what? It allows a person to take the small amount of empirical knowledge that they have, and then through analogy and through reasoning, extend it through a huge field of data that they would never have been able to deal with at all. Now, later philosophers, actually not even later philosophers, even Greek thinkers like Plato, they also posited that there's a third type of knowledge, what they call in the Arabic translations and recensions of Aristotelian logic, they call it ilm al-wada', which is that knowledge which is placed in amongst human beings and in human experience that comes from an external source, which is what we talk about as revelation. And Plato also posited that there are other worlds or other levels of existence from which knowledge filters into this world. Many philosophers, they rejected that this type of knowledge exists. Many philosophers, they accepted it. Obviously, Islamic thought accepts the idea that there is knowledge that comes from a higher realm. But one very interesting thing is that the mutakallimun, the scholars of scholastic theology in the Muslim tradition, of the Ash'ari school, of theology, and to some lesser degree of the Maturidi school of theology, they considered a person who is a Muslim, they considered that Muslim's faith not to be valid unless it's arrived at by completely rational means. What does that mean? That means if someone asks you from an intra-Islamic perspective, if someone asks you, are you Muslim? You say yes, and they say, why are you Muslim? If you don't understand in rational terms why you're a Muslim, then according to a great number of the mutakallimun, that faith is invalid. It's not considered to be a valid form of Islam. So if you say because this X, Y, and Z things that make sense rationally, that is the bridge that takes you to the point where, okay, you can validate what, whatever other information comes. If you can validate the source of the information, then whatever information, whether you understand it or not, that information is valid. If the source is not validated, then the information that comes from the source also necessarily, you cannot make any judgment with regards to it. So if a person says, well, I'm Muslim because my parents are, I'm Muslim because the Hoja in my masjid is a very pious man, and he loves, orphans, and he is a very pleasant person, and his voice is nice, and all these other things, and he seems like a smart guy, or whatever. This is not valid. If someone says I'm Muslim because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is Muslim, this also is not valid. Why? Because you have not arrived at the validity of the source through a rational means. What's different between you and a person who worships like whatever, the elephant god? And he says, well, I worship the elephant god because the priest of our temple, he's a nice guy and he takes care of orphans and he has a beautiful voice and all of those other things. Now, when presented with this interesting piece of our tradition, if you were listening to me, a sense of alarm should come over you like, oh, smack, I never really thought about these things before. In fact, very few people I know have ever thought about any of these things before. This is kind of a problem. I agree, it is a problem. I agree that it is a problem. I wouldn't go and start saying to everybody, well, you're not a Muslim because you haven't you haven't examined your sources or whatever, many of these pieces of information are more beneficial for you to use for your own introspection than they are for you to go and start throwing rocks at other people. But the idea is that you should get to the point where you understand the existence of God with a type of yaqeen, with certainty. And if you cannot do so, it's a severe problem. It's a big problem. Now, being a person who is who has gone through like a Western university, I graduated from the University of Washington with a Bachelors of Sciences in Biochemistry and a Bachelor of Arts in Near Eastern Languages. So I took 3 years of Uzbek also, which results in me understanding a little bit of Turkish and confusing a lot of people when I try speaking. But the idea is that there is this kind of like false assumption that's mutadawil. It's a common currency amongst people in Western academic institutions that like you can't prove God exists. And oftentimes, well-intentioned people who are religious, they will kind of use the shield and say, well, I believe it based on faith, and I have blind faith, and you just can't understand it. You have to take it on trust and whatever. This is absolutely something alien to our tradition, our intellectual tradition as Muslims. Maybe other religions, they have this idea that their creed is based on some sort of holy or sacred mystery or whatnot, that's their beliefs. I'm not in a position to comment on them because I don't know. I feel like I don't know so much about my own tradition. How am I going to comment on somebody else's? But as Muslims, the idea that your belief in God rests on some sort of holy mystery or whatnot is something that that the tradition very roundly rejects. And the classical argument that Muslims make for the existence of God is a rational one. It's not an empirical one. And this is the thing that kind of professors the world over have made a litany of jousting their students by saying, well, can you show me God? Can you see Him? Can you hear Him? Can you touch Him? If you can't do so, then He's your imaginary friend up in the sky. The problem is what? All of those questions are all empirical or rational. They're all empirical. If anyone has even a cursory reading of the Quran, they'll understand that it's part of the creed of the Muslims that God is empirically unknowable. لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار ليس كمثله شيء ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Most High, the visions cannot see Him even though He sees the visions. There is nothing like anyone like unto Him. There is no one like unto Him. These are pronouncements that occur in the Quran again and again. You're not able to see Him, you're not able to touch Him, you're not able to sense Him, to the point where this has become a universal principle in the creed of the Muslims, that God is fundamentally, empirically unknowable. Empirically unknowable. The only way your senses can understand, the greatest understanding your senses can have of Him, is that if your senses can see something or experience something, then you know that that's a proof it's not God. So it's a knowledge based on negation, not on affirmation. That is why the testimony of faith in Islam begins first with nafi, with negation, and then with ithbat as an exception to the rule. La ilaha illallah, that there is no God, meaning whatever you see, taste, smell, touch, you can print it on a t-shirt or on a poster or look at it on a website, that's a proof that's not Him. And this is, see, I said Him, oh my goodness, because we have like all this like slew of things. How come God is a He and not a She? We consider this to be mutashabih. We consider the use of the pronoun to be allegorical. If anyone actually uses the word He to refer to God and thinks of it as a biological gender, that person is not a Muslim. At any rate, so that was over very quickly, wasn't it? Coming back to the idea that, can you see, taste, smell, touch Him? The question is, from a Muslim philosophical point of view, it's a wrong question to ask. It's a wrong question to ask. My feeling is what? Is that the reason many people who are atheists is because the God that they disbelieve in is a God that's empirically knowable. Meaning you have like you have Greek philosophers that, you know, or the ancient Roman religion where you have like, or the ancient Germanic religion where you have like you know, Odin and Thor with a hammer and shooting lightning bolts at people. And it's kind of like a Marvel comic superhero. It's like a person, but like souped up, and like you can't really beat him up, and he can fly and do weird magic tricks and stuff. But essentially, it's a person. It's a souped up person, but essentially a person. Someone says, "This is bogus, man. I'm not just some loser in the sky is throwing lightning bolts on me. How can I define my own existence based on that? This is a person like me. One person is physically stronger than another. Everyone is human inside at the end of the day." So I feel that many people, their rejection of God is based on this kind of empirically knowable caricature of divinity that they have, that there's a man with a white beard, probably resembling Santa Claus, sitting on a chair in the sky somewhere, and we know that that's not possible, and we know that, you know, like what does that mean? How do you get a chair in the sky? Where is the sky anyway? All of these things. These are questions. They have really no place in any sort of contemporary setting. Oh my goodness.
Space.
Oh, space? All right. Oh, there we go. Oh, you gotta unlock this bad boy here.
No, there is, yeah, just click on it.
Okay. Awesome. Oh, nice. So, our old philosophers, by and large, they said that God is empirically unknowable, and they held this precept as a universal tenet of faith. But when asked for a proof of God's existence, what did they put forth? A rational proof. A what? A rational proof. Anyone here studying and hoping to become a doctor one day? Inshallah. Nobody?
Not this university.
Oh, you guys have that? You guys split people up by... What are the people in this university studying to be? Engineers, scientists, and things like that? Okay, that's wonderful. Alhamdulillah. Hey man, I use bridges too, man. Who am I to hate on someone else? Yeah. So the idea is that God is knowable not empirically but rationally. What is the proof that they put forth? It's very eloquently summarized in the Arabic expression "Hajatu kulli makhluqin lis-sani'i," the necessity of every created thing for a creator. The necessity of every created thing for a creator, meaning that the empirical world that we live in, the world that we can experience around us, every effect has some sort of cause. Right? If I were to, for example, say, look back there, and you turned around and you looked and I threw the mouse and it hit you in the head, you could very reasonably assume that I'm the one who threw it at you. Why? Because mice don't fly through the air on their own. And if I were to say to you when you turn around, hey, you said, hey, why did you throw that at me? I said, well, I didn't do it, it just happened on its own. You would not believe me. And it's because you're smart. That's why you wouldn't believe me. There's a famous debate between Abu Hanifa and an atheist in the Abbasid court in front of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur in Baghdad. And the fact that such debates could happen is a proof that the early generations of Muslims were not, homicidal fanatics, but they're people who enjoyed discussing things with other people and who tolerated other people's dissent, especially when that dissent was heartfelt, even if they disagreed. So Abu Hanifa, he shows up really late to the debate. He shows up hours late, and when he shows up late, the Khalifa is embarrassed, the courtiers and the ministers of state are embarrassed, the people who are there to witness the debate, majority of whom, if not all of whom, are Muslims, they're all embarrassed, and the atheist scholar who's debating him is livid. He says, what is this? We don't agree on creed, but this is something that we hold in common. As a Muslim, you're supposed to keep your word and you're supposed to be on time. And so something strange happened. Abu Hanifa said something strange happened. I had to cross the river to get from Kufa to Baghdad, and there was no ferry boat, and I was under anxiety that oh my goodness, now I'm going to embarrass the Muslims by being late to this debate, so I frantically paced back and forth for a great amount of time, and then something amazing happened. Which is what? Which is a number of trees, they felled themselves and they separated into planks. And those planks came together and they turned into a ship. And I sat on the ship and the ship itself took me across the river, and that's why I'm here now. So the atheist says, this is ridiculous. What kind of dumb story is this? I don't know what's worse, the fact that you were so late or the fact that you tell me such a ridiculous story that there's no heads or tails of it. I don't understand what the point of it is. It's obviously not true, and I don't even understand why would you fabricate it. And so he said, well, if you believe that it's impossible for a small raft to make itself spontaneously, then what about the entire universe? And it caused such a disruption in the gathering that the debate was over right there. And this is something also, mashallah, I mean, no one's going to become a doctor, but is there anyone who read at least like general biology? Anyone? Yes. So they have this thing, they have like a nice little blip, you know, usually in a corner of the textbook, talking about the idea of spontaneous generation. The European philosophers in the Middle Ages, they thought that, or they posited that life spontaneously occurs. So if you took like a piece of rancid meat and wrapped it up in a damp rag and threw it in a dark cellar, it will one day turn into a rat. And so the reason they mention these things in the textbooks is the subtext of it is like, look how stupid people used to be, we're smart. Look how stupid people used to be, and look how smart we are. So they write that, and then they say, you know, with great pride, they talk about Louis Pasteur and these experiments where he boils broth and seals these, what you call flasks, and then the broth doesn't rot, as a proof that the biological agents are not spontaneously generating, rather they come from outside through microbes and different things like that, and how he proved this and kind of put this to the end. And there's still in France in a museum somewhere a flask full of broth that hasn't rotted for centuries and whatnot. And this is like a great pride and achievement of science and of learning. Now, those are empirical facts, right? You can empirically verify that the broth didn't rot, okay? Now, and I have no debate with that. Those empirical facts, those are things that are universally held. A person who doesn't accept them, there's other issues going on. But tell me something, so the belief that a piece of rancid meat in a damp rag in a cellar somewhere doesn't turn into a rat, is the rancid meat and damp rag, is it greater than or less than nothing at all? Is a piece of rancid meat in a damp rag, is it greater or less than nothing at all? It's greater, right? I'm sorry, we should have served coffee before the talk. This is more of like an 8 o'clock in the morning type of talk, maybe, right? The meat in the rag is greater than nothing, okay? Is the rat greater than or less than all of existence?
Less.
It's less. So a priori, right? What they say in the books of logic in Arabic, right? بِالطَّرِيقَ الْأَوْلَى. The a priori analogy is what? If it is irrational to believe that a piece of rancid meat in a damp rag can turn into a rat, then it's even more irrational to believe that nothing will spontaneously turn into everything. So which thing should be laughed at now? Which thing should be? From a rational perspective, I contend it makes absolutely no sense. Now, what people have said in response to this is they say, well, if that's the case, then who created God? And come back to the wording that we made in the beginning. The wording that we gave in the beginning is the necessity of every created thing. Of every what? Every created thing for a creator. Now, why is God the exception to this rule? Because we contend that all things, whether they are physically tangible or whether they're intangible, that are knowable, all of them are the creation, and then there's a creator beyond that that's unknowable. So simple things like time and space, these are also the creations of God. This is one of the reasons Muslims rejected the idea that God can be born in the flesh in the world. With all due respect to people who believe in Christianity, these are different beliefs that we have. Inshallah, they have a chance to also explain their beliefs, and we should listen to what they have to say as well. But this is one reason that Muslim philosophers had a difficult time accepting things like saying that God can be born in this world in the flesh. Why? Because a part of something cannot be greater than the whole. If God is greater than His own creation, how can He be a subset of His creation at the same time? Rationally, it didn't make sense to them. Rationally, it didn't make sense to them. It didn't rationally pass muster. Now tell me something. If God created time, this is something, listen a little carefully, is going to require a little bit more thought than generally, whether you want to eat at McDonald's or Burger King for dinner, okay? If God created time, then asking what happened before creation, this is not a valid question. Because it's tahafut, it's an incoherent question. Why? Because if time doesn't exist, then before and after, do they have any meaning? Absolutely not. And so I guess a simpler way of explaining this is, for those of you who are as old as I am, or older than I am, you'll remember that, like movies at the movie theater, they used to be like there's one reel that was empty and there's one reel that had a film on it, and both of them spin, and there's like little pictures that go one after the other, 30 frames per second, and when the movie is over, the film will transfer completely from one reel to the other. So a movie might be like 90 minutes long. You watch it from beginning to end, 90 minutes. It's from the beginning to the end, you experience it in a very linear fashion. Now what if I were to take the wall and backlight it? Put like light bulbs in the wall and make the wall out of some sort of translucent or transparent material, and then splice the entire film up on the wall at the same time. Theoretically, I could look at every frame at the same time, couldn't I? Now, I'm not saying that this is how God experiences time, but the idea is that even people who are in theoretical branches of physics understand that the linear experience of time is not the only way of conceiving of time as existing. So time is just this thing. With regards to the Creator, to ask before, after, did He change His mind? It's from the Islamic point of view, it's not a coherent question to ask. Why? Because time itself is a creation. So to say, well, who created God? No, time and space is a cage that we're in, but all of existence isn't in that cage. There's a realm of existence beyond that as well. Otherwise, what? Otherwise, we have this thing in what you call cosmology that they call what? They call the Big Bang. Right? Anyone here familiar with the Big Bang? Okay. Anyone here lived sometime in America? Okay. The word bang on street language, does it have a nice meaning? Right? It's a synonym for the F word, basically. Right? Oh, astaghfirullah, Shaykh, what are you talking about now? This Hujjah is crazy. He's came to my university and said curse words, astaghfirullah. Right? There's a point to it. Why do you think they called it that? This is the most important. This is the most important thing that happened in the entire history of existence, that both atheists and religious people can agree on. Because if it didn't happen, none of us would have been here. So that same Big Bang, from it was made the material of your favorite football team, and from it was made Mecca and Medina, and from it was the flesh of Christ alayhi salam, and from it is everything that your mother and father, everything that you love and hold dear comes from that one event. It should be something important. It should be something awe-inspiring that we all respect universally. Why call it the Big Bang? My feeling is the reason it was called the Big Bang is that philosophically it causes a problem. Because ancient atheist philosophers used to justify their lack of belief in existence of God by saying that existence is circular. It's not linear, it's circular. Cycles that propagate themselves again and again and again. In fact, there are many even religions, right, like Buddhism, Hinduism. The cosmology of those religions is cyclical. It's completely cyclical. That's why God as a concept is not as important in those religions. Right? Jainism has the same cosmology. It's essentially an atheistic. It's an atheistic philosophy. It's not even a religion in the sense of believing in a God and worshiping that God. So the idea is that that there's a cyclical existence that never ends, and the highest achievement that a person can do is to be liberated from that this kind of pointless merry-go-round that just never ends. Right? The idea is that the universe always existed and it will always exist, and it just goes through cyclical reiterations. Now this is actually in logic, right? Aristotelian logic, not some hoja with a beard and a turban, but Aristotelian logic. This type of argument is called an infinite regress, a dawr al-musalsal in Arabic, and it's actually a type of fallacy. It's considered a type of fallacy because it's like the verbal equivalent of dividing by zero. If you divide by zero, you can make anything equal anything. In a mathematical proof, if you divide by zero, you can make anything equal anything. It completely gunks up the process and makes all sorts of irrational things possible. So, but they held firm to it. I posit that the reason the Big Bang is referred to in that way is that a majority of the people who in contemporary times are at the forefront of material sciences, not all people, the sciences of material things, they're by and large atheists. And now we can pinpoint a beginning of the universe. We can empirically pinpoint that there's a beginning of the universe, and what's beyond that beginning, it has to be something, it can't be nothing, but that something is beyond any sort of empirical understanding. Philosophically, it's very problematic. It's very problematic for a person who doesn't, whose creed is that there's no creator, there's no God. And if you say, well, who is it, and blah, 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 what did we say in the beginning? We said the Muslim understanding of God is what? Is that he is, oh my goodness. Anyhow, okay, there we go. That he's empirically unknowable, but he's empirically unknowable. And now what happens, okay, you have like theoretical physicists that say, well, maybe the universe expands and then it'll contract again, and this thing happens cyclically, or something happens in one dimension which seeds the Big Bang in another dimension, or there are all these, okay, that's great, that's wonderful, but tell me, is it empirically provable? Absolutely not. So who has an imaginary friend that you can't see, taste, smell, or touch anymore? Who believes in pie in the sky now? So these are all very important things to think about. That which assumptions do people make, and which assumptions do people tout as if they're some sort of absolute truth, whereas really they're sometimes on equal footings with other people's assumptions rationally, and oftentimes they're inferior as well. And my humble opinion is that human beings, it's impossible for them to be purely rational. They have their own biases, and oftentimes the most objective people are the ones, in fact always the most objective people are the ones that can admit their own biases. The one who says, I have no bias, that person is the most biased person of them all more often than not. And the idea is that what? There's a certain personality which will not want to accept the existence of God. Okay, God meaning not like grandpa in a chair in the sky, but God as the rationally necessary creator. And there are a certain set of people whose disposition will cause them to be inclined toward accepting that. And then afterward the mind will use its own logic in order to justify what it wants to. But to say that there's no rational existence of God, this is something that there's no proof for the existence of God, this is something that's utter nonsense as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not saying that from a blind faith point of view. I think intellectually it's a very easy thing. It's not like this is not some sort of year-long class that we had to go through. Maybe you have to listen to the recording once or twice more in order to get all the details, but it's not like a super sophisticated set of reasoning. If someone says to you that you cannot prove God exists, you'll say what? Empirically speaking, I agree with you. Rationally speaking, I disagree with you.
So what was your proof?
Who asked the question? Yeah. The proof is حاجة كل مخلوق للصانع, the necessity of everything in the world of cause and effect to have a cause in order for it to exist.
So what if somebody doesn't agree with that?
No, whether they agree with it or not is a secondary issue, right? The first thing is that, did you understand what was said? I can say 2 + 2 = 4, and someone says I don't agree with you. That's more of like that's a secondary issue. I agree, but the idea is this: is that we see no precedent in the world of causes and effect for something that exists spontaneously without a cause making it happen. So because of that, we can make an analogy rationally to say that those things don't exist.
So you're still basing it, on experience. It's not totally rational.
And that's what rationality is. Rationality is not knowledge in and of itself, but it is a system that allows you to use the empirical knowledge you know in order to extrapolate knowledge that you don't know. So this what you call module we will probably skip. But the idea is that I don't like using the term West because like one of the places I studied traditional Islam was in Mauritania, and Mauritania, parts of it are actually further west than like Spain and Portugal. So we'll say in Europe or in Western Europe, because you can't even say Europe because we're in Europe right now, aren't we? Right? So in Europe, west of whatever, whatever. Revolutions, rebellions, and the civilizational trauma of the Franks. All of these things they happen in the history of Western Europe. And I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. And this is not meant to be some sort of like harf akhir, like authoritative like pronouncement about this is the way history is and done. Because people who are sophisticated and who are mature understand that history is not. Really, things don't go down simply that way. But the idea is what? There's a set of events in Europe that happened historically that push people intellectually in a certain direction. And the summary that I want to give of this entire thing, it hinges around what? Around the French Revolution. So France is a large and powerful state in Western Europe. And it is the bride of the church, meaning what? It is the most loyal polity to Catholicism and to the papacy, and really in that sense to Christianity as a political force in Europe. And that France, what ends up happening is it goes through, and there's a lot of glossing over things in general because of time limits. So please don't be so upset. Inshallah, maybe there can be another session where you call someone who's very qualified to talk about this subject. Or if you wish to call me, if that person says no, I'd be happy to come as well. There's a lot of details that we're glossing over, but the idea is like the Crusades itself. What is the reason that tens and hundreds of thousands of people go to participate in the Crusades? Part of it is definitely religious fervor. Part of it is the fact that, like in Europe, they have primogeniture. If you're the eldest son, you inherit everything, and sons like 9 through 12, maybe the first 2 or 3 they can get an education and become some clergymen or businessmen or something, and the rest of them are basically high and dry and out of luck. What are they supposed to do? Well, this sounds like a good way of making money and having some sort of purpose in your life. The French Revolution is what? There's this like economically catastrophic set of policies that causes France's economy to snowball out of control, and as a result, the monarchy levies super harsh taxes against the public, and then a number of famines and poor harvests happen, which means that which makes the public at some point in the late 18th century they're stretched to the limits. And the king will call a meeting of the Estates General, meaning what? That the nobility, the feudal nobility of that country, and the clergy, the people who are members of the church, and the peasantry, basically anyone who's neither a clergyman nor a noble, all of them, they come, and the 3 parties they meet as equally represented parties in this gathering. Now, I would posit, far be it for me to speak on the behalf of Christianity. We have Christians who can do it, but I think it's far-fetched that you would find a Christian clergyman who would disagree with this, that the duty of religious people and the duty of clergy in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, in these three traditions, is what? Is to act as a voice for the voiceless and power for the powerless, as a voice for the weak and for the oppressed and for the poor against the rich, the powerful, the enfranchised. And when this duty is ignored, a great amount of mischief will happen. When this duty is ignored, a great amount of mischief will happen. Well, what happens is when the Estates General, they get together, the nobility are exempt from taxes and the clergy are exempt from taxes, the peasants aren't. Rather than casting their lot in with the peasants, what does the clergy do? They cast their lot in with the nobility, and they basically keep trying to put the burden down on the peasant class, which is already stretched to the max. The entire feudal system in Europe is like this problematic thing. What is a feudal system? If you're not an aristocrat or a clergyman, you're essentially like some kind of slave that's tied to the land. There's maybe some exceptions for a urbanized class of skilled laborers that emerges slowly with time, but in general, the majority of the populace, you're a serf. You're like a peon. You're tied to the land. When the land is sold, the ownership of your rights is sold with the land that you're in, and you're expected to work the land without having a share of the economic proceeds, right? And if it sounds like communist propaganda that I'm spouting right now, let's just say not all ideas, whether you agree with them in totality or not all ideas are completely nonsense. There's a reason these ideas gained currency and that people believed in them and thought that there's some value in them, because people understood that this system is oppressive. This is one of the reasons that Muslim Spain and Muslim Sicily were so successful. Is that when the Muslims conquered these lands, it's not, maybe from some inward and spiritual perspective, one can say what? That okay, the barakah and the blessings of the prayer and the reading of the Quran and blah blah blah, they cause some sort of prosperity to happen. That may, from some point of view, be what we call a distant cause. But the immediate cause of what? The immediate cause of the success is very simple. You have these serfs. This new government that comes says, hey, you own the land that you work on, and however much produce there is in the land, you will get a share of the success of that produce. What will that cause the productivity rates to? What is it going to cause? Nothing, or is it going to cause it to go down or go up? It's going to cause it to go up because now they have an incentive to work harder and work smarter and figure things out and innovate and whatever. And so I would say the immediate cause of success of the Muslim political entities in Sicily and Sardinia, in southern Europe, in Spain, Portugal is what? Is that economically they had a wonderful policy that gave people means to acquire wealth, and because of that the productivity went up, and when the society is materially comfortable, then other more intellectual or spiritual pursuits now become possible when you're no longer fighting every year just to stave off death and starvation. So what happens, the French Revolution, there's this impasse, and the clergy, they instead of choosing to side with the people, who do they side with? They sided with the government. Now hindsight is 20/20. It seems to me it wasn't a very wise decision for them to take, because the people, when they rebel against the government, they overthrow the government, they overthrow the clergy with them. And they seize huge amounts of church lands, they completely shut off means for the function of the Catholic Church in France, and the part of the Catholic Church that's allowed to survive is like housebroken, it's domesticated, so to speak, so that it has no or very little scope to exert any sort of independent influence on the state. And what I contend is, because of all of these things that have happened in the experience, the collective experience of Western Europe, it is a false assumption that what? Two things are false assumptions that exist in that society, or that are false universals. They may be particularly true for that society, but they're not universally true. One is what? One is the assumption that all authority is bad. The idea that the government is a necessary evil and it needs to be mitigated at every turn. Otherwise, it's going to default into some sort of tyrannical rule. Whereas in Muslim history and Muslim civilization, there are examples. There are examples of absolute power making states that are very successful, both for the rulers and for the populace. Now, this may be a very controversial statement, and I don't have the time to prove it, and I'll concede if you disagree with me, but I think it's an idea worth considering. It doesn't mean that every single government that had absolute power is always good, and it doesn't mean I am advocating absolute power for governments. But I'm just saying the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely, I think we have precedent in Muslim rule that, for example, the Ottoman Empire itself was essentially a Sunni theocratic state. Which is such a, it's like such a problematic thing to say. You know what I mean? Because people like Sunni theocratic state, they think of like someone's cell phone video, like a beheading or something like that. Whereas you cannot build like all these huge masajid and administer an empire that spans, continents, and have millions of people from different religions and different nationalities and different ethnicities and different languages. You can't do all that if you're a crazy dude who's just chopping people's head off just because someone smoked a cigarette or something like that. You understand? You can't do it. That can't happen without a very rich and vibrant culture and tradition. And so I feel that the reason that this assumption exists, that that religion is lurking around the corner in order to basically rob you of your rights, and the idea that all authority is bad authority, I believe that is something that Western Europe has imbibed due to its experience, and you cannot blame anyone for making assumptions based on their experiences. This is one, as a side note, this is one reason Muslims, if you have a beard and whatever, you should smile at people, and you should be nice to them. You should tip the waiter a little bit more at the restaurant, because who knows, maybe the only person that they saw in the beard is that crazy guy in the video that's beheading people or whatever. Does it mean necessarily that it's true? No, it may be a faulty assumption on that person's part, but a human being cannot help but to make assumptions based on what their experience is. And the idea, if you make this a universal principle, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, then what's the highest power and what's the highest authority in existence? God. So what if absolute power corrupts absolutely, what does that necessarily mean about God? So, can you understand why a person who has this mindset is going to then automatically dislike religion? Now, it's predicated on a number of assumptions that we don't agree with, we don't consider to be correct, and we don't require another person to accept as correct. So perhaps that's one way that a person who is a practicing Muslim with some sort of connection with the intellectual tradition of Islam might say, like, not understand why a person would think that way. But it's very important, whether you agree with somebody or you don't agree with somebody, it's important always to try to understand why they think what they do, try to understand where they're coming from. There's nothing wrong with that. You can disagree with a person, you can say ultimately your pronouncement or your judgment regarding a matter, I don't agree with it, but it's always important to understand, why does this person think the way that they do? Why does this person come to the conclusion that they have? So with that, I want to go into the last part of what I'm going to talk about today. And how much time do we have left? What? Half an hour? Okay. We'll try to wrap it up in less than that. So we come, all of this is like a tamheed. It's a forward to talk about just a number of basic assumptions that people have. And I would like to humbly posit that I believe that these things are not universal facts or universally true. Rather, they're unexamined assumptions that we have that merits a second look and some modicum of scrutiny. See, believing that seeing is believing. You know, they say seeing is believing. What is that? Would someone who says seeing is believing, would that person, are they expressing any sort of faith and rationality? No. All of their faith is in what? Empiricism. If you say seeing is believing, That means what? That your primary connection is with what? Empirical knowledge, not with rational knowledge. Modernism is different than contemporaneity, meaning it's not talking about living in a certain time because everybody is imprisoned in the time that they live in. Rather, a point of time is relative to the observer. Modernism is an outlook characterized by a family of philosophies which have become the cultural and civilizational norm for Western Europe and those places connected or influenced by it, meaning basically most of the world. Many of its philosophies are falsely taken as axiomatic and are accepted by many without thought, consideration, or reflection. The first one, empiricism, and a reductionist outlook towards science and learning. A complete denial or downplaying of anything which is extrasensory. A preference for hyper-specialization in learning at the expense of holistic models of understanding. And a magical faith in science. The belief it will answer questions that it isn't asking, and more properly within the purview of philosophy and religion. The belief of that material mastery. Okay, so let's stay here. Okay, what do you say? Magical belief in science. What are you saying, Hoja? Are you saying that science, shouldn't believe in it? No. The idea, someone says, Shaykh, can science answer whether God exists or not? Well, listen, it's not asking that question. If science is what? That you have a hypothesis, and then you subject that hypothesis to some sort of empirical examination to see if that thing actually plays out or not. Can you see that it's playing out or hear that it's playing out? If we say God is empirically unknowable, then this is the wrong question. Science doesn't ask the question, why? In an ultimate sense. Okay? You can say like, okay, an electron is attracted to a proton. Why? Because they have opposite charge. So that's not in a far sense answering the question why. That's in a near sense, right? That's the proximal cause, not the distal cause. It is definitely not the ultimate cause, right? What if someone asks you why is it that an electron attracts a proton and not another electron? Is there somebody who can empirically answer that question? All you can say is just is what it is. And now you've come back to the same point that, like, if a child is learning Quran from the Quran teacher and says, how come the alif is a and not u? And the Quran teacher says, shut up and keep reading Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq, and hits the stick, It's the same thing. There's no other response to that question. Science isn't asking that question. So does this mean I'm anti-science? No. Science is a very wonderful tool to find out things like what the boiling point of methanol is. Okay? So I'm not going to say, no, this science is going to lie to you about methanol and let's go to the mosque and start praying and then we'll find out about methanol. Obviously that's not the case. The whole point of we're going to go down a theological road that we don't have time for, but the idea is that if you accept science, the answers that it gives with regards to the questions that it asks, that's a healthy acceptance of science. If you think science is going to do something that it's not doing in the first place, that's where we get to the magical faith in science. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is not like a categorical rejection. It's just an understanding that, look, this is something, it's doing this one function. To think that it's going to do a different function, that I have a screwdriver, it puts screws into the wall. Okay, now I have a nail. What am I going to start stabbing? It doesn't work. It's not going to work. Belief that material mastery will one day solve all problems. This is wonderful. This is like philosophical cake. Okay? The idea that if only we could have more knowledge regarding the material world, that one day we'll solve all of our problems. We'll have solar energy. It will be wonderful. Nobody has to pay any bills anymore, and everyone will be happy. And we can go around in electrical cars, and we don't have to use oil anymore. And then we don't have any wars in the Middle East, and no more war in Iraq, no more war in Yemen, no more war in Syria. Everybody's friends. Listen. Oil never made you kill anybody else. Oil never made anyone kill their brother. It's choices that we make as human beings. Even if we live in a cave, eat raw meat, and wear fur animal skins, if a person harms another person, it has nothing to do with technology or with material understanding. It has to do with something else. Those are spiritual problems. Those are not issues with regards to how much material science you have. Now tell me something. Right? We have all of this advanced material knowledge. Did we use it to solve the problems of the world? Absolutely not. There's so much food that goes in the garbage every day. It's more than enough to feed the entire world several times over. America, we grow so much corn, less than half of the corn, less than a third of the corn actually that we grow, is used for human consumption. Much of it is just burned because the government wishes to keep the capacity for production, but they don't want to mess with the market prices of the commodity, so they'll burn it or they'll turn it into ethanol. Still, people starve to death. Now, tell me something. The increase in knowledge regarding material sciences, right? It made certain advances possible, like what? Like the nuclear weapons. Is that solving someone's problem? It's making a whole other set of problems. It's absolutely horrible. It's utterly detestable. What kind of sick mind is going to use knowledge which was supposed to be to help one another and to make the world a better place and all this other stuff, that people used it in order to, a'udhu billah, make new and more efficient ways of killing people and poisoning the land, poisoning the air, poisoning the water. This idea that somehow technology is going to solve our problems, this is magical thinking, this is a magical faith in science that expects from it something that it wasn't there to give you in the first place. Those problems are solved by other things. Those problems are solved by other things. A relative lack of value for the humanities, right? So science is going to solve all of our problems. Then somebody who studies philosophy is not going to be lauded like and celebrated like Plato and Aristotle. They're going to be told no one's going to marry you, go to become an engineer or become a doctor, right? A general shift to preference to quantitative metrics at the expense of moral, principle, and even aesthetic considerations. Now, it's interesting, even science itself requires rationality. Even science itself cannot function on empiricism itself. Now, there is, for example, simple things that we don't really think about. These are assumptions that we have. We never examine them at all. Anyone know Roman numerals, how Roman numerals are counted? Right, you tally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then or you can make a V for a 5 and an X for a 10, etc. Can you do long division using Roman numerals? Absolutely not. Can you do calculus doing Roman numerals? Absolutely not. So there's this thing that they call Arabic numerals. I have to protest, being from the Indian subcontinent. It's not the Arabs who came up with it. They're just the ones who passed it to Europe. And so Europe is like, oh, thanks. I guess these must be Arabic. Not acknowledging that it came from somewhere back behind the Arabs as well. The most amazing number in the entire system of Indian Arabic numerals is what? By far, it's 0. 0 is utterly amazing. 0 is not a number. 0 is a philosophical concept. 0 is not someone's like, show me 0, and they show you something. That's not 0, because 0 is nothing. The fact that someone could write it down on the board, that's amazing. We take it for granted, and, but it's really this amazing thing. And from the barakah of this 0, right? For those of you who are spiritual people, right? If we just said that for God the best number is what? 1. For us the best number is 0. You can think about that. That's not a university type subject to talk about. I'm gonna spare you that dialogue. But the idea is what? Is that this 0 you cannot see it, smell it, taste it, touch it. But if just like God we jettison it because it's empirically unknowable, then what happens? You guys are becoming engineers, right? Who here's mashallah thermodynamics? Any thermodynamics people here like thermodynamics, right? What is the all these like values that they use for thermochemistry, like for entropy, right? What is the 0 state of entropy? It's like the perfect crystalline structure at absolute 0,
ground state, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is absolute 0 observable in the lab?
No.
Then how come you talk about it? Is it your imaginary friend? Are you a backward medieval person for talking about absolute 0? There's so many calculations. There's so many calculations that require us to accept these things that are they're philosophical concepts. They're rational concepts. They're not empirical concepts. The idea that people have become so dogged into empiricism to the point where they're even not paying attention to rational thought, and philosophy is considered to be this one like some sort of like fruity like pseudo subject that doesn't require any sort of thought, what ends up happening is that you'll see people will move further and further and further away from rationality. Empiricism is going to result in that. It's going to result in a degradation of people's ability to understand anything except for the most immediate of ideas, the things that are affecting them physically right then and there. Which is you know, suffice to say, we don't have a long time to go through examples, but suffice to say, it's not a good thing. And you don't have to be praying 5 times a day in the Jami to know that that's correct. Faith in the future and disdain for the past. The idea that everyone in the past is an idiot, and because I have Android and iPhone and Twitter and Facebook, that I'm somehow qualitatively different than they are. This is an assumption of modernity, right? So you have what happens, right? A faith in change and disdain for consistency, and it causes a rise in plastic terminology. What is plastic? Plastic is this material. You can mold it into whatever you want it to be. Rich in connotation. So the words, you can say them and they make you feel a certain way, but bereft of denotation. They don't actually mean anything solid. Okay? So something is revolutionary. Okay, so if I come with a revolutionary product, is that good or bad? Say, just blurt it out. Good. Revolutionary.
Good.
It's amazing. It's wonderful, right?
Awesome.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
What if something already is, what if something's already good? Right? What if you have like a government with a just ruler and everybody's happy? Is a revolution good or bad? And like the witch king of Angmar wants to like turn everything into darkness. Is a revolution good or bad at that point? It's bad. But whenever we hear the word, oh my goodness, this is revolutionary, right? Evolution, right? Evolution is what? So people have this idea that somehow Islam is not compatible with evolution. I don't know. The idea of the independent assortment of genes and natural selection doesn't seem to be anything unreasonable about it to me. Does that mean mankind is descended from apes or not? That's a secondary discussion. The primary discussion is what? Just the idea that genes assort independently, and whatever is fittest in terms of a genetic combination will survive and propagate into the future. So evolution and so people say things like, in biology they'll say this is a more highly evolved species than the other species is. Well, if the old genes are working, what's the need to evolve? If you live in a garden, then you'll evolve to be beautiful like the things around you. If you live in the muck, if you live in the sewer, you'll evolve resistance to all sorts of bad things, and your body will find a way to benefit from the urine feces that you're swimming inside. If something is evolved, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's neither. It's a value neutral judgment. Revolution, it's a value neutral. It could be good, it could be bad. It depends on your context. But we have this thing where these assumptions that are ingrained inside of us, that someone said revolution, that must be amazing, that must be wonderful. Even though historically that's where everyone gets killed and stuff gets burned down, but for some reason we're in love with it, we're infatuated with it. Progressive, right? Progressive is wonderful, right? Progressive is wonderful. What if you're standing at the edge of a cliff? Is progressive good? It's neutral. It's a value neutral. Shaykh, are you saying progressive is bad? I'm not saying it's bad. It's just neutral. You can't tell just based on that one word whether something is good or bad. You have to be objective when you think about it. Now I have to pull out a gripe that I have both with irreligious people and with religious people. If you don't believe in absolute truth, then everything is relative, and you'll frame your judgments about everything around you in relative terms, not in absolute terms. Okay? This whole idea, I'm liberal, I'm conservative, absolutely annoys the living daylights out of me. Why? Everybody should try to look for what's best. The arrow should be shooting for the bullseye, for the mark. To define yourself by a type of deviancy that you have, or a type of excessiveness that you have. This is not good. And this is why in America, you see, for you guys it must be very entertaining to watch. Unfortunately, we have to watch it play out ourselves every day, right? This Democrat, Bill O'Reilly on one side, and like whatever, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Conservatives are horrible, deplorables, you're deplorables. Half your population just insulted the other half of the population. Is this good for the country? Absolutely not. right? And the liberals are insulting the conservatives. The conservatives are saying, oh, liberals are destroying everything. Read any American newspaper and read the comments section. And it's, people are talking about each other like they're like sewer like animals. Is any society going to be successful that way? Absolutely not. Right? So what? There's all these plastic terms that this outlook bequeaths us that you know what? They don't really mean anything. There's buzzwords. If someone gets up and says, okay, paradigm, narrative, discourse, ethos, zeitgeist, oh my God, this guy might be smart. He must be a really smart person. Right? Using terms that obfuscate meaning is not a sign of intelligence. The intelligent man is not the one who can take something that's easy to understand and confuse everybody. The intelligent man is the one who can take confusing things and make even the simple-mindedest of people understand it. Bright-eyed, naive modernism has been jettisoned by Western European intelligentsia for nearly a century. Anyway, the idea is, even these ideas, in much of Europe, they're jettisoned already. For some reason, in the Muslim world, people cling on to them because they're behind the trend in fashion. People who lived through 2 world wars, they said, okay, yes, this technology is just going to make us chlorine gas one another, right? So modernism is what? The idea that everyone is in the past is an idiot and we're smart. Postmodernism is they're idiots, we're idiots, and there's just idiots coming as well. Now, I have to admit, there are some times that I think that that's really bang on the mark. But the point is, if you want to improve something, it's not a healthy, that level of pessimism is not a healthy way of going forward. There's some good in the past, there's some good in the present, and there will be some good in the future. Everything should be evaluated based on its own merits, not based on assumptions. Right? You guys saw me and said, this guy maybe doesn't speak English. Okay, I speak a lot of English, maybe you're wrong, okay? Anyhow, I think that's enough. We've gone on long enough.
I think we can have a short Q&A session.
Short Q&A?
It doesn't need to be short. If you guys have any pressing questions, just go through it.
Okay, mashallah. I see the sonar finds danger. Please, go ahead.
So you made an analogy like based on like the corruption of the absolute government and the corruption of God. So like, how come you can make this analogy without making without even an impersonated conception of God? Because like, if God is like this, not uncreated thing, not impersonated, you cannot make that analogy.
So that's mashallah. I can tell that you're a person who has a mind that is more accustomed to examining things and not taking assumed things to be true. I'll say a couple of things. One is that you're right; it is a false analogy, and the second is that the people who and I posited before saying that this is a personal theory of mine. It may be correct or it may not be correct. It's just an idea that I have. But the people who I feel that this thought process goes through their mind, their conception of God is very different than the pure kalam theological conception of God amongst the Muslim intelligentsia. And the third thing is that they actually did see religion as a source of corruption in their society. And I'm not saying this to impugn Christianity at all. As a Muslim, there are many parts of Christianity that I disagree with, but I think it would be unreasonable to believe that anybody who follows the teachings of the Gospels would be in any way led to being insensitive to the plight of poor, oppressed, or disenfranchised people. Rather, it flabbergasts me to no end how conservative Christians in America and in the West can be so heartless toward poor people and disenfranchised people. And in defense of practitioners of Christianity, there is a remarkable establishment of practicing Christians that point these inconsistencies out and fight back against them. But yeah, I agree with you. Essentially, it's a false analogy, and it's not. I mean, it was more of a caricature rather than any sort of robust, proved theory or formulation. Yes.
While talking about West Europe, you said it is wrong to make an assumption from our experience regarding religion and authority, because they have a bad experience. But while proving the existence of God, you also use an assumption which is also from our experience. You said all effects has a cause. I don't.
Yeah.
And why?
So yeah, I mean the thing is that experience, one experience is anecdotal. The other one is anecdotal means what? It's a personal experience. For example, maybe when I was a kid, maybe I don't like soccer because when I was a kid, everyone on the soccer team used to make fun of me. You understand? That's anecdotal. It's a personal experience, whereas certain experiences are universal. To my knowledge, that every effect in the material world has a cause is something that nobody has any sort of empirically replicable exception to that rule. Whereas the experience that the West has with theology with theocratic rule versus the experience that other traditions have with theocratical rule, I think it's reasonable to assume that there can be differences. Any other questions? Yes.
There are people who would say, for example, what do we say to people, for example, who say, no, we do believe that there is a creator, but we just don't give credit to religions. Because as you mentioned, we all have like something emotional linked to some words that has to do with the past we have or how we understand things. So the way we interpret the Quran or we interpret the Bible, etc., is always big. We are all subjective at the end. So what do we say to people who, for example, say, okay, yes, we believe there is a creator, but we do not believe in the subjective understanding or the subjective, let's say, applications of, let's say, the existence of this creator on earth. For example, Christians would say, since Adam has been created, no other human being has been created the way Jesus has been created. So he's the most special prophet or messenger, etc., etc. Or some people would say, reading the Quran, this doesn't mean, or I don't understand this as I have to wear a hijab, for example. I understand it this way. And so who sets up the rules? Because we all are subjective. So I kind of understand sometimes people who say, I believe there is a creator, but I do not believe in the subjective interpretation of it. This is religion.
So that's a very interesting question, which is probably the answer to which is it's going to take more time than we have, but it is a good question in as much as it allows me to put forth a precept I think that's important for the understanding of truth.
You're good on time.
We don't have enough time to talk about that. It's not the subject of specifically. It's not the subject of what we're talking about. I didn't want this to become like me preaching Islam to the people. That's not really what the subject that was advertised. But there's a precept I think that is the beginning to answering that question, which is what? There's an idea in the usul, in even the legal philosophy of Islam, that ideas, when they go from universality toward particularity, and when they go from abstractness toward concreteness, the further they go in that direction, the weaker and weaker and weaker their relationship with truth is. Truth with a capital T, absolute truth. Islam does believe in absolute truth, that there are certain things that are absolute truth. Whether a woman has to wear hijab or not is not. It's not primarily an absolute truth. It can be based on, okay, I believe that God exists, I believe that He sends messengers, I believe that Muhammad ﷺ is one of His messengers, I believe that the hadith and the Sihah Sitta are reliably transmitted, I believe that this one hadith that says that, whatever the awrah of a woman is everything but her face and her hands, means, what it literally says rather than some sort of allegorical reference to something else. You have to rationally prove so many things on the way there that the reason the reason I thought this would be a nice presentation is because it's like it talks about step one, But there are like 7, 8 different steps you have to get there. Now, does it mean that that's wrong or right? It is right. I mean, for example, I'm a practitioner of the Maliki school of fiqh. It's a Sunni school of thought. And in my school of thought, there's an entire constructed, an entire constructive argument that proves or that asserts that very point. But for example, if somebody says that, well, I don't agree with that, right? The locus of the disagreement, you have to locate where it is in these like 7, 8 steps. The lower the locus of the disagreement is, the less serious that disagreement becomes. So it comes to a point, for example, that regarding like particular issues in the law, right? When you sit in the tashahhud in the prayer, should you move your finger one time or should you move it back and forth? There are certain villages in the Muslim world, if you move your finger back and forth like this, the villagers are illiterate people. They'll say, this guy is mocking the prayer, we're going to break his finger, right? But really, when you go and study these things, based on a principled understanding, it's like not really that big of a deal because it's like 14 steps down the road. What my personal feeling is that it is the personal responsibility of everyone that they must come to the conclusion with regards to these first couple of basic things. And then afterward, as a civilization, it's a collective responsibility for every civilization to, in their time, understand all of these matters and then preserve the more detailed and ancillary aspects of this tradition. But it is a good question, and I think that maybe understanding this precept of things being the most true in their abstract form and the least true in their concrete form, the most true in their universal form and the least true in their particular form. I think this will give some sort of insight as to why I didn't choose that to be the beginning of the discussion, rather something that's before it. I apologize if it sounds like I'm dodging a question. It's just a matter of time because then everyone has to leave and things like that. Okay, going once? Anyone? Going twice? Okay, go ahead.
The question is that, like you said, you mentioned that God is unknowable thing, like, and you refer to Quran as like you can't see God, you can't touch God. But then I think like when we discuss the concept of God with other people, like from other religions, or with atheists or with others, I don't know. When I make this, like it's kind of postulated in a sense, like I'm saying to prove something to them but I'm using something from Quran to prove something or to make my claims. But how should they echo in their mind? Because they are not accepting Quran as a source of post-claim. And now I'm just confused over there. How do you make sense of it?
So this is this question, if I'm understanding it correctly, it has to do with the etiquettes of discussing things with different people. Now, if a Muslim, for example, is discussing some sort of philosophical question with an atheist, then quoting the Quran in your discussion with that person is not useful. Why? Because they don't believe the Quran is correct in the first place. So the idea is, and this is one of the reasons that with regards to discussing the existence of God, we went through a completely rational process, or at least attempted to go through a completely rational process. And what is the value of logic? We mentioned in the talk the value of logic. The value of logic is what? It is that set of things that all rational people agree on. You can believe in one God, 10 gods, no gods, elephant God, whatever God, anything you want, right? But everyone agrees that, the whole of something is greater than its part. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. These types of common things, everybody will agree on them. And so this is really important that when you discuss something with somebody, if you don't both sit together and acknowledge what you agree on and use that as a bridge for your discussion, then two people will just shout at each other. It's just going to cause a fight. And this is actually a very interesting segue because there's going to be a set summer program. called the Ihsan Academy. You can register for it online, and it's going to be a set of classes with regards to basic foundations of traditional Islam, as well as studying certain subjects of importance to civilization. And so I have taught the Aqidah Tahawiyya, which is a simple book of Muslim creed, many times in America. I've posted the lectures online, and hopefully I'll be able to come and teach that in Istanbul in the summer as well. I love this city, and I would love to a chance to come back whenever I'm able to. So the idea is that one of the points of creed of Muslims is what? Mira and Jidal are bad things. And Mira and Jidal are two synonyms in the Arabic language for argument, but they mean a specific type of argument. That is the type of argument where, look, when two people are debating with one another, you put your ideas forth and the other person listens with respect and with attention. And then that person puts their ideas forth, and then you listen with respect and with attention. Then you ask questions for further understanding back and forth, and both parties come to the table with an idea that maybe I'll learn something. That is one of the best forms of learning. Mira and Jidal is not that. Mira and Jidal is what? I'm smart, this person's an idiot, I'm going to go and ask them questions and make a fool out of them, and we're just going to go back and forth and just trade insults with one another on the occasion of some sort of question. That's a point. It's not a point of law, it's a point of creed in Islam that there's absolutely no benefit in it. If you cannot find out how to talk to a person beneficially, then there's no point in talking to them. Talking to them just going to end up causing hatred and all these other problems. As far as the idea of saying that God is unknowable, I didn't say that God is unknowable in an absolute sense. I said He's unknowable empirically. Through the senses, He's unknowable. But the ma'rifah, the gnosis of God, it's not something that happens through the mind, it's something that happens through the heart. And that's a completely different... and when I say the heart, I'm not talking about the physical heart. Right? The heart is... there's something in the physical body, it has two atria and two ventricles, and it pumps blood. That's your physical heart. It's a physical organ. The spiritual apparatus of a person has an organ in it called the heart as well, and the heart is the seat of intention inside of a person. Now the problem is, in empirical outlook, they say spirit doesn't exist. You're just a bunch of neurons and this and that are, and you know, this chemical reaction, that chemical reaction. So that's a very difficult discussion to have. In order to prove that the spirit exists itself is going to be another like 6-hour presentation. So at minimum. But the idea is, if a person were to assume that the spirit exists, the heart, which is not the seat of rational processing, it's something else. That's the place where a person knows God. And if you try to know God with your intellect, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. The text of the Quran itself says that what? That they're not going to be able to understand any of His knowledge except for the small bit that He gives to them. Islam itself contends that the mind is not going to be able to understand Him because He's beyond understanding like that. It's something that's a separate topic, and that's a separate I guess discipline within our faith.